I have always heard stories about a little village named Hollowbrook. It's the kind of town you only visit when you have to, and then you never want to return to. I actually grew up not too far away from it, but never thought much about it, until Sarah, my girlfriend, had convinced me to spend Thanksgiving with her family there. It all started the day before Thanksgiving. The weather was rather damp and dreary for days. It's very typical of late fall in this area. Sarah had been planning this trip for weeks, and I had reluctantly agreed. To be honest, I wasn't thrilled about it. Hollowbrook always seemed a bit off, and I heard some pretty unsettling stories from the people who had visited there. But Sarah assured me everything would be fine. It's just an old town, she said. They have some quirky traditions, but regardless, it's beautiful there. So we set off on an ATV ride in the afternoon. We figured we'd explore the outskirts of the town before we got dinner, get some fresh air and take in the landscape, really be in the moment. The Blackwood Forest wasn't too far away from Hollowbrook, so I heard that area was great for off-roading. The plan was very simple: ride through the woods and head back before dark and grab some food. The wind was already picking up as we rumbled along the trail. The trees seemed to almost lean in towards us, like to snatch us. Their gnarled branches were reaching out like twisted fingers, almost scraping the sky, but the scent of the pine and decaying leaves had filled the air. The deeper we got into the woods, the thicker the fog had become. It was rather strange. It was almost unnaturally thick, like the fog had been hanging in the trees for days, not moving. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, and as we drove further, the trail became less clear and evident. The ATV began to sputter over some rocks and uneven ground, but Sarah, given the adventurer that she is, kept pushing us forward. I didn't mind it at first. Whenever my girlfriend wants to do something, I usually support her, but I was more worried about getting back before sunset. But then, we came across something that really shouldn't have been there. We stumbled across a clearing, an ancient stone structure that looked like a weathered altar. It was covered in thick moss and strange carvings. Immediately I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something deeply unsettling about it. The air immediately felt heavier here, like it was laced with something ancient. As we stepped closer, the ground beneath us seemed to shift, as though we had crossed some invisible boundary into something. My stomach immediately churned. "What the hell is this?" I asked, looking around. Sarah shrugged her shoulders, but her voice was excited. "I don't know, but it's amazing. Look at these markings." She knelt down to examine the carvings more closely, but I just couldn't take my eyes off the altar. That whole scene just looked so strange. The stone was slick, almost like it was coated with something. I felt a surge of nausea. I couldn't place it at first until I realized what the dark patches were. They were blood. I saw that, I grabbed her arm and I pulled her back. "Sarah, we need to go now." But Sarah resisted. It was probably just an old campsite, maybe some ritualistic stuff from the past. Let's just take some pictures and go. I didn't really care about pictures. The place felt wrong. It felt dangerous, and the deeper we ventured into the clearing, the more I felt it. The wind had picked up again, swirling in unpredictable gusts, as though the forest was alive. Something didn't feel right. The trees felt like they were watching us, like they were caving in on us, their branches twisting their fingers, the shadows shifting unnaturally. We finally decided to turn back, but as we started to retrace our steps, we realized we were no longer alone. We could hear people, villagers. We saw them in the distance walking towards us. Their feet were crunching the dry leaves in unison. They emerged from the darkness like ghosts. They were dressed in long, dark coats, and their faces were hidden beneath hats. They didn't speak, they didn't say much. They surrounded us, forming a circle around the altar. My pulse quickened as they began to gain in on us. Their faces were grim, their eyes were dark with something that I couldn't quite understand. I opened my mouth to ask what was going on, but before I could speak, Sarah pulled me aside. "We need to get back to the house," she whispered. Her voice was trembling. I didn't argue with her. We started to walk towards the clearing's edge. "It's time," one of the villagers had said. Before I could ask what he was talking about, because I was so confused and so threatened, Sarah took my arm and began pulling me towards the ATV. We got back on the ATV and we started to accelerate. The villagers were behind us. They didn't run after us, they just simply stared at us. Their eyes were hollow and unblinking. That was the last I saw of the villagers. Once we returned to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. The air inside the house was thick and the silence was unbearable. "This was definitely the most interesting Thanksgiving that I've ever had," Sarah said, and I told her that it was an understatement. We stared at each other in silence. Everything from that point on was pretty calm. Nothing else happened. We didn't see any villagers or anything out of the ordinary for the rest of the Thanksgiving holiday. But we decided to look up online some information to see if we can get an idea of what we saw. So we found out online from a Reddit post from a random user that the villagers of Hollowbrook were participating in an ancient ritual. They typically would offer human sacrifices to the land, because the villagers believed the land needed to be fed with human blood to ensure the town's prosperity, good harvest, safety, and survival. Instead of offering crops or animals as a ritual, they sacrifice a person, usually an outsider, to the unknown force that's tied to the land. It's a dark tradition that's been passed down for generations, and the villagers see it as a necessary means for their survival. It's been a long and difficult year for my family, and I wasn't sure if Thanksgiving was the right time to try and mend the old wounds, but I hadn't seen my brother Ben in over a year. After his accident, it felt like I was losing him, not just physically, but mentally. He was never the same after his accident, but when he had called a week before Thanksgiving, asking if he could come over for dinner, I felt a tightness in my chest. And I thought, maybe it was time to try this again. I would love to bring the family back together, even if I wasn't sure what I was hoping for. He had been medically diagnosed with a severe form of dissociative amnesia. It was a disorder that basically caused him to lose chunks of his memory, sometimes weeks or months at a time. But after the accident, when he was hit by a car while out on a run, things had seemed to change. The doctors said that he was lucky to be alive, but whatever damage had been done to his head had seemed to affect more than just his memory. His behavior was very strange and unexplainable. He would forget who people were. He would lose track of the time. He would forget to eat. His emotions would swing wildly from calm to volatile. It was hard to tell if he was himself anymore, but when he had showed up to my door, I had to pretend that everything was normal. I couldn't let the weight of my worry for him show. So I opened the door, and there he was, standing on the porch, looking like a shadow of the person that I remembered. His face was thinner, his eyes were dark and sunken, but the whites in his eyes were almost barely visible, basically like he hadn't slept in days. His hair was tangled, matted down from weeks of not caring for it. He said in a low voice, "Hey sis, happy Thanksgiving." His smile was very crooked, but it didn't really reach his eyes. I smiled back. I felt like it was strained, but I pulled him into an awkward hug. "It's good to see you, Ben," I said, trying to sound more cheerful. I led him into the house where the smell of turkey and stuffing had filled the air, and where our parents were already sitting at the table with the rest of our family. They all greeted him warmly, though I noticed the hesitation in their eyes. They hadn't seen Ben in a long time either. It was hard to act like everything was okay. Dinner began with the usual chaos between the family. The clatter of plates, the loud conversations overlapping, everyone talking at once, but Ben just sat there. He barely said a word. He sat there with his hands resting stiffly on the table, staring at the food in front of his face as if it didn't interest him. His fingers twitched every now and then, like he was trying to stop himself from doing something, but I wasn't sure what. "Ben," I said, trying to draw him into the conversation. "How's the new place? Are you getting settled?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, his eyes locked onto mine. You know that strange, distant look you get when you see someone or something very far away? After that long pause, he told me, "I don't have a place anymore." My heart had skipped a beat. What do you mean? Didn't you get a room at Aunt Carol's?" I'd asked, glancing nervously at our parents, who were busy with the turkey. Ben just shook his head slowly. "No, I don't think I ever had a place, not really." His voice was so quiet, it was so off. I couldn't tell if he was just being a critic or if he just truly didn't remember. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I tried to ignore it. It was Thanksgiving after all, and I didn't want to ruin the evening with weird conversations. But something was off. Something was wrong. Something about Ben was wrong. The air in the room was thick. It was suffocating, like the walls were closing in. I kept glancing over at Ben, watching his hands twitch beneath the table, gripping and releasing the edge of his plate, as if he was fighting some sort of internal struggle. His eyes stared at the food. His lips parted like he wanted to speak, but he just couldn't find the words. But when he finally spoke again, his voice was lower. It was almost a whisper. I saw something outside earlier." My blood froze. "What do you mean? You saw what?" Ben looked up at me, his pupils blown wide. His eyes are now fully black, no whites at all. Something. It followed me home. His smile began to open, almost painfully, and he said, "It's hungry." Me and the family tried to laugh it off, and my dad made a joke. "Well, feed it, we're here, it's Thanksgiving." And I tried to remain serious about it, and I said, "Ben, you've been through a lot. Maybe you're just tired and hungry. Grab something to eat." And for the first time since he arrived, and now that I think about it, the first time in a while, I saw real fear in his eyes. No, it's real. It's out there. Before I could ask him anything else, Ben got up from the table, and without saying a word, he walked into the hallway, with his footsteps echoing down the hallway. I looked over at our parents, but they were still talking. They were just too distracted to notice anything wrong. It's insane how delusional they were about his condition. I could feel the panic building into my chest. I knew he'd been dealing with a lot lately. His medical condition, the dissociative amnesia, it just kept him in a fog. Sometimes he'd forget things, or even forget who he was. I knew it could be tough for him, so I figured, let me follow him and see what's going on. "Ben, you good?" I asked. He didn't answer me at first, but then he just nodded and started walking further down the hallway. I thought about letting him be, but something about the way he moved made me feel uneasy. Ben's episodes could get weird, and I didn't want him wandering off in a daze, getting hurt or something, so I followed him. The house just felt off, like it was just too quiet, and the air was thick. It was almost suffocating. The hallway was dark. There was some ambient light available, but that light casted shadows that stretched pretty unnaturally. It looked a little weird, but I just ignored it, so my footsteps echoed down the narrow space as I trailed behind Ben, trying to catch up. I called his name. "Ben, where are you going?" He didn't answer. He just kept walking, much slower now, almost like he was dragging his feet, like he couldn't quite hold himself up. I felt a pit in my stomach. This was different than his usual episodes from what I remember. He didn't look like he was lost in thought or spacey. He just looked scared, like he was avoiding something. The first thing I noticed was when I saw his face. His eyes were wide. I stepped closer to him. "Ben." Still, no response. He stopped in front of the empty guest room. It was the same room he'd always stayed in whenever he had visited. He just stared at the door, not moving. I thought maybe he'd forgotten why he'd walked this far. But then his hand reached out for the doorknob, and his fingers were trembling, almost like he was avoiding going into there. It was then I realized how wrong this whole thing felt. "Ben," I said more sternly. My voice was shaking a bit now. "What's going on?" He turned his head slowly, and for a split second, I saw fear in his eyes, real fear, not just the confusion that usually came with his condition. And then he whispered, "It's not over. It's never over." I grabbed his arm, trying to steady him. "Come on, let's get back to the living room, buddy, okay?" But he yanked his arm away from me, and he stumbled into the room. "They're here," he muttered. "I can feel them." I hesitated, just standing there in the dark hallway, the weight of his words just kind of sinking in. If you were actually there, you could probably picture how terrifying this was. My heart was pounding in my chest. I don't know why, I just didn't turn around then. Maybe I thought it was just his condition. Maybe I thought if I followed him, he could snap out of it. Whatever the reason is, I stepped into the room. The light was off in the room, but there was a faint glow from the street lamps that were outside. It was enough to make out the shape of the room. I saw the bed, covered in blankets, a dresser by the wall, a chair tucked in the corner. It looked like any other guest room, but there was something wrong about it. The air felt heavy. I felt it pressing down on me. It was thick and suffocating. Ben was standing in front of the window now, looking out at the yard. He was breathing much faster. His eyes were darting around the room like he was waiting for something, expecting someone or something. "Ben, please," I said, stepping towards him. "Let's go." I reached out to touch his shoulder, but just as I did, the door had slammed behind me, and I jumped. Heart was racing, and I spun around, but the door was locked. I was trapped inside with Ben. I turned back to him, and that's when I noticed it. There was a figure standing in the corner of the room. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a shadow, maybe nothing. But then the figure moved. The figure moved like it was human. It was too tall, though. Its limbs were too long, and it bent at odd angles. I felt a weird surge of panic rise in my chest. I took a step back, but then I couldn't move, my feet glued to the floor. I tried to call out, but no sound came out of my mouth. The figure stopped just in front of Ben. He didn't seem to notice it. He was still staring out the window, just breathing heavily. His face was pale and frozen, with that same expression of terror. But then the figure, as it looked at me, it smiled. The smile was wide. It was too sharp. It was like a grin that split its face in half. Suddenly, Ben turns around from the window, and I feel a sudden chill crawl over my skin, and I wake up from a jolt, gasping for air. My chest feels tight, like I've been holding onto my breath for hours. I blink a few times, trying to shake off the disorientation. The morning light filtering through the window tells me it's early, really early. I'm in the guest room, and that's exactly where I was last night after dinner. The room is quiet, normal, nothing out of place. It's empty, and the bed was rumpled from where I must have fallen asleep. But the house, it feels off. It's too quiet, and I just can't shake the feeling that something's missing. I look at my phone, and the date reads Wednesday, November 27th, the day before Thanksgiving.